these sections is going to be about poetry from a philosopher and about art from an artist. And then another short session, the last session, after, again, a short break, is going to be about the works you see outside, so that you better understand the context and their meaning. My name is Rodica Mocan. I come from Babeș-Bolyai University, a university in the heart of Transylvania, for those of you who are not very familiar where we are. And I'm very honored to be here in this old university and absolutely beautiful. I'm stunned at the architecture. Ours is also a nice university, but not at this level. And I'm just envious on my colleagues for teaching in this environment. So without further introduction, I would like to just introduce our next speaker that comes from England. This time we moved from Oxford toward Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken. And just excuse me because I didn't prepare my notes. Professor Douglas Hedley is a professor of philosophy of religion and a fellow at colleges at Cambridge, at Clare College, at Cambridge University. And his field is philosophy and theology, and in philosophy, which is not my field, is specialized in Platonicism and Neoplatonicism, which is very interesting. He is co-chair of a section of the American Academy of Religion and a past secretary of British Society for the Philosophy of Religion and president of the European Society of Philosophy of Religion. Now, it's hard to talk about these things without bumping into philosophy, and it is my understanding that now he's going to link it to poetry. So, Professor Hedley, we're going to listen to you.
I assume it's okay for me to...
Just turn on the microphone.
Speak. Okay. So can you all hear me? Good. Okay. Well, if I may first thank the organizers of this conference for their very generous and kind invitation. It's a very great privilege to be speaking in this beautiful ancient university town. So, C.S. Lewis, Edmund Spenser, and Irish Poetic Theology. Platonic ideas abound in the imaginative writing of C.S. Lewis. In The Silver Chair, Prince Lilian is kidnapped by the Green Witch in her underground world. The witch shook her head. "I see," she said, "you have seen lamps, and so you imagined a bigger and better lamp and called it the sun. You have seen cats, and now you want a bigger and better cat, and it's to be called a lion. Well, 'tis pretty make-believe, though to say truth it would suit you all better if you were younger. And look how you can put nothing into your make-believe without copying it from the real world of mine, which is the only world. But even you children are too old for such play. As for you, my Lord Prince, that art a man full grown, fie on you. Are you not ashamed of such toys? Come, all of you, put away these childish tricks. I have work for you all in the real world. There is no Narnia. There is no overworld, no sky, no sun, no Aslan, and now to bed all. And let us begin a wiser life tomorrow, but first to bed, to sleep, deep sleep, soft pillows, sleep without foolish dreams." Now, this passage is full of reminiscences of Plato's Republic, and one might note that it is the witch who is insisting upon empirical reality, reality in inverted commas. Even the imagery of sleep and awakening is profoundly Platonic. In 5.2c, In the Republic, Plato writes of the need for philosophers to return to the cave and dwell with their fellows. And so our state and yours will be really awake and not merely dreaming like most societies today with their shadow battles and their struggles for political power, which they treat as some great prize. You're sure you can hear me? I'm sorry, it's just I'm not used to microphones, so yeah. However, C.S. Lewis's deep Platonism is not always immediately evident. And the suggestion of this essay is that there's a distinctively Irish dimension to the Platonism of C.S. Lewis. Its specific argument is quite simple. The thought of Edmund Spenser, 1552 to 1599, was of deep and long-lasting significance for the thought of Lewis. The Renaissance poet, Edmund Spenser, was born in England, but lived for much of his adult life in Ireland. Clive Staples' Jack Lewis, 1898 to 1963, was an Irishman who lived most of his life in England and seemed strikingly English to observers. But Lewis was inspired by the 16th century Englishman domiciled in Ireland. And yet the connection between the two runs much deeper. Spenser produced a Platonic, poetic theology of the supernatural in his unfinished epic and chivalric romance, The Fairy Queen, an allegorical work that exerted considerable influence upon Gothic and Romantic writers, not least William Blake. And Lewis was profoundly indebted to Spenser as a thinker and to his poetic theology. Milton wrote in his Areopagita of our, quote, sage and serious poet Spenser, whom I dare to be known to think a better teacher than Scotus or Aquinas. And the significance of Spenser as a Platonist was pivotal for Lewis. Now, this deep link between Lewis and Spenser generates a particular difficulty in relation to what I've called Irish Platonism. Edmund Spenser is notorious for his savage critique and ruthless proposals in the posthumously published dialogue, A View of the Present State of Ireland. And Lewis was entirely aware of the complex and disturbing aspects of Spenser's activities and attitudes in Ireland during the Tudor conquest. In fact, Lewis noted that, quote, Spenser was the instrument of a detestable policy in Ireland. The wickedness he had shared in begins to corrupt his imagination. But while, for Lewis, the imagination of Spenser was deformed by the brutality he participated in, Lewis was nevertheless adamant about the genius of Spenser. If only some contemporary literary critics could be as nuanced as Lewis in these matters. So this is what Lewis says. I have tried not to conceal his faults. On some of them I have spoken more severely than most of his professed admirers. His prosaic, even prosy tendencies I almost claim to have set for the first time in their true light. I have exposed without extenuation those unpleasant passages where he becomes a bad poet, because he is in certain respects a bad man. But they must be set beside the barbarity of Homer, the hatreds of Dante, the pride of Milton, and perhaps, we may add, Shakespeare's apparently contented acquiescence in the ethical tomfoolery of honor and revenge. I do not mention these things with the absurd intention of exalting Spenser by deprecating others. I merely wish to indicate the level on which Spenser stands, the poets with whom he is to be compared. There you get a sense of the centrality of Spenser for Lewis's imagination. So Lewis argued further that we should see Spenser not just as a great poet with a lamentable history, but also as a figure whose creative output was decisively shaped and inspired by his Irish context. Lewis considered Spenser to be a man shaped by his experience of the Irish countryside. So Lewis writes, "It's difficult not to conclude that this represents his growing, though perhaps unadmitted, reconciliation to what had once been his place of exile, but now became his home. He was coming to need that Irish life, the freedom, the informality, the old clothes, the hunting, the farming, the fishing. He was proud of the super excellent trout in his own river at Kilcolman. He may, as a poet, have needed the very country. There's a real affinity between his Fairy Queen, a poem of quests and wanderings and the undistinguished desires, and Ireland itself, the soft, wet air, the loneliness, the muffled shapes of the hills, the heart-rending sunsets. It was, of course, a different Ireland from ours, an Ireland without potatoes, whitewashed cottages, or bottled stouts, but it must already have been the land of longing. The Fairy Queen should perhaps be regarded as the work of one who's turning into an Irishman." So the Fairy Queen is then for Lewis the precious product of this long sojourn of Spenser in Ireland. Now, there's also a specific philosophical link between Lewis and Spenser through the Cambridge Platonist Henry More. Though under-recognized, the Platonic dimension is integral to Lewis's thought, and More's writings were a key conduit by which the philosophical tradition came to him. So I'm just quoting from P.H. Brazier in his C.S. Lewis and Annotated Bibliography. "Platonism is a type of philosophy that he, Lewis, not only subscribed to, but which characterized his work throughout his life. Many Protestant, Reformed, or evangelical supporters of Lewis's work today strongly object to his Platonism, not realizing that it's fundamental to Lewis's interpretation of the gospel and is at the heart of his understanding of Revelation. As a young Don, Lewis was profoundly influenced by Henry More, 1614 to 1687, who was one of the most prominent of the 17th century British philosophers. More was a leading member of the Cambridge Platonists, emphasizing mystical and philosophical theology." So that's in Brazier's Annotated Bibliography, page 156. Now, More, like Lewis after him, found Spenser to be a fertile reservoir of Platonic ideas and themes that proved foundational for his thought. In his dedication to his father, Henry More notes how the older man tuned his son's ears to Spenser's rhymes, quotation, "entertaining us on winter nights with that incomparable piece of his, The Fairy Queen, a poem as richly fraught with divine morality as fancy." It would seem from this autobiographical note that Henry More's first encounter with Platonic philosophy was at the behest of his own father, and specifically in the form of Spenser's The Fairy Queen. But as we shall note, the links between Spenser and Ficino in particular are deep. Of all the Cambridge Platonists, Henry More is the one who starts off his career with a poem, and early on in that poem, Henry More writes, "Rise then, Aristos," he for some reason he calls it Aristo, "son, assist my muse, lest that he sprite, which did enrich thy brains, with choice concede some worthy thoughts infuse, worthy thy title and the reader's pains." So this is Henry More with his eulogy of Spenser as the inheritor of Ariosto. And William Hunter remarks of More that it was odd to see him adopting all the external trappings from Spenser, the complicated stanza, the archaic vocabulary, the old-fashioned syntax. Now, while C.S. Lewis never completed the dissertation he began on Henry More, his first book was a work that culminated in the thought of Spenser, The Allegory of Love, published in 1936. And the kinship between the poetic philosopher and the philosophical poet was clear to Lewis. Through the Platonic influence on Spenser, although the Platonic influence on Spenser has been a subject of some controversy, Lewis is forthright on this question. So here's a quotation from C.S. Lewis. Spenser wrote primarily as a Protestant Christian and secondarily as a Platonist. Both systems are united with one another and cut off from some, not all, modern thought by their conviction that nature, the totality of phenomena in space and time, is not the only thing that exists. It is, indeed, the least important thing. Christians and Platonists both believe in another world. They differ, at least in emphasis, when they describe the relations between that other world and nature. For a Platonist, the contrast is usually between an original and a copy, between the real and the merely apparent, between the clear and the confused. For a Christian, between the eternal and the temporary, or between the perfect and the partially spoiled. So you can see how he's very adamant about Spenser as a Platonic poet. And on this model, it's possible for Spenser to be both intensely biblical in his allusions and thought, while adhering to the strongly Platonic perspective. Athens and Jerusalem, the Hellenic and the Hebraic, are fused in this poet of love. Christianity and Platonism share the same longing for transcendence. And one of the main differences highlighted by Lewis is that the human soul is not the seeker, but the sought. In Christianity, according to Lewis, there is a philanthropic dimension to the deity, and there's an initiative on the side of the divine. Now, this may or may not be the source of irreconcilable differences, but Lewis makes it clear that Spenser does not view this as a clash between faith and philosophy. When Lewis is considering the vexed question of the relationship between Christianity and Platonism, his position is characteristically nuanced. He notes emphatically that Spenser is a Christian Platonist. That is to say that Spenser's Platonism is decisively modified by his Christian faith, which is not to claim that he's incoherent or muddled. And as I've already suggested, the influence on Ficino on Spenser is key. Now, whilst the question of Renaissance Platonism is not without its own complexities and controversies, Marsilio Ficino constitutes one of the pivotal figures of the Western intellectual world. The medieval period was profoundly influenced by Platonism, but this influence was largely indirect, transmitted by the Church Fathers and the Arabs. Plato and Plotinus were barely known. Their arguments and ideas were transmitted via Augustine, Boethius, and Origen. The profound influence of later Neoplatonism upon Denis the Areopagite and the Liber de Causis meant that the dominant direction in medieval Platonism was that of later Neoplatonism. Now, Ficino was a watershed, first of all because of his translations of Plato's works and those of the Neoplatonists. So for the first time in the West, there's direct access to these texts, and his hermeneutical construction of Platonism as an imperfect but indispensable image of the Christian economy of salvation. So his work, this is Ficino's, provided not only an extensive and intensive interpretation of Plato, but also deployed Plotinus as the interpretative frame for his reading of Plato. So this meant that the most sophisticated and original Platonist of late antiquity was rediscovered and raised to an important place in Renaissance philosophy. Now, as we've noted, there is some history of the debate about Spenser's Platonism, and especially his debt to Ficino. Josephine Waters Bennett argued for a profound influence of Ficino upon the Fairy Queen, but this was contested, notably by Robert Elroth, and there has been a subsequent debate about the extent or nature of Spenser's Platonism. But Valerie Rees, in her exhaustive article in Spenser Studies, Ficinian Ideas in the Poetry of Edmund Spenser, mounts a thoroughly convincing case for the influence of Ficino upon Spenser. It's likely that Edmund Spenser encountered Ficino while at Cambridge, but even if not, the influence of Ficino was widely felt. We know that friends of Spenser owned works of Ficino, and it's clear that the thought of Ficino was significant in the culture of the 1590s. England, 1590s England, so much so that Bruno was spotted plagiarizing Ficino while he was lecturing in Oxford, so Giordano Bruno, of course. Now, the influence of Ficino was not always direct, and later writers influenced by Ficino may be the source of Ficinian notions in Spenser. But in terms of textual influences, we can see this strong link between Henry More, the Platonic philosopher, and the Spenserian poet, and via Spenser to Ficino and the Italian Renaissance. Hence, and I think this is worth stressing, the Platonism involved is thoroughly Christian. A more recent scholar of Plato has written, "It has been possible to write love poetry without Cupid, not only because the experience of love has gradually divorced itself from religion, but also because poetry has given up its anxious alliance with Scripture. But for Spenser, the scriptural resonance, notwithstanding his Platonism, remains pivotal." So I realize my watch has stopped, so how long have I got?
We're running late.
Okay.
Many minutes, but you're still within your time.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. So, lying behind the Platonism of C.S. Lewis and his reception of Edmund Spenser is the central theme of symbolism. The Platonic tradition is a bearer of rich models of the symbolic, in which there is a homology between the symbol and the domain symbolized, an ontological bond between the image and its referent, grounded in the creator. To Spenser, in fact, as to Shelley or Plato, there is no essential difference between poetic beauty and the beauty of characters, institutions, and behavior, and all alike come from the daughters of the sky-roving Jove. This is another passage from Ficino. "It is the opinion of the ancient sages that men, that is, souls, come down into this life from God himself, as though into a comedy or tragedy, where all things commonly considered favorable or adverse are merely fables. Imagined riches and poverty, imagined kings and slaves, and likewise imagined birth and death. Perhaps the Platonic saying, 'The human race is God's play on earth,' points to that." Ficino is referencing a passage in Plato's Laws, where he says that humanity is the paignion, theou is the toy or plaything of the deity. The author of this play in fable is God himself, who is also the father of souls. He therefore sends them down from on high into this play, his actors, but it is the nature of the world which gives them their parts. Now, in this passage, Ficino is drawing on a theme in Plato and Plotinus about serious play, serio ludere in the Renaissance tradition. But he's also generating a theory of symbolism. God is envisaged as the author of a fable, and the world as a domain of enigmatic images pointing beyond themselves to a transcendent reality, as though through a glass or mirror darkly. And Lewis tends to think of allegory as standing for specific psychological experiences, whereas symbolism bodies forth an invisible world through images. Lewis writes of Spenser's allegory in explicitly Platonic terms. So here's a quotation from Lewis. "We shall find that it is Spenser's method to have in each book an allegorical core, surrounded by a margin of what is called romance of types, and is relieved by episodes of pure fantasy. Like a true Platonist, he shows us the form of the virtue, his studying not only in its transcendental unity, which comes at the allegorical core of the book, but also becoming many in the world of phenomena. That's in the Allegory of Love, page 234. Lewis means that as a true Platonist, Spenser is committed to a theophanic vision of the created order, the meaning of which is best understood by the comparison with Spenser's sonnet, "More than most fair, full of the living fire, kindled above unto the Maker near." As Lewis remarks, we know that the sun is an image of the good for Plato, and therefore of God for Spenser. So the symbolism of the poet is connected to the metaphysical vision of the empirical cosmos as the enigmatic likeness of its transcendent source. For in the Neoplatonic thought with which I've been connecting the passage, this is Lewis speaking, it was fundamental that all great truths should be veiled. The wise know that a naked and open exposition of herself is distasteful to nature, who, just as she has withheld an understanding of herself from the vulgar notions of men, has also wished her secrets to be treated mythically for the prudent. And such a model relies on this Platonic paradigm of the physical cosmos participating in the intelligible world. The particular power of Spenser for the erudite Ulsterman resides in his capacity to generate a sense of wonder. Comparing Spenser to Ariosto, Lewis notes, "You will find no difficulty in sharing that Spenser is hopelessly inferior to his model. His loves and wars are intolerably languid compared with the briskness of the Italian. We feel at once that Mandricard or Roland would have made short work of all these slow-moving, heavy-spoken fairy knights, whose allegory seems to encumber them more than their armor. As for Bradamante, inimitable Bradamante, by her side Britomart is little better than a big-boned country girl. Her speech is dull and pretentious, her love sorrows without dignity. She carries her nurse about with her and often suggests the Anglaise of continental tradition. Nor will Spenser's small zoo of monsters, his reiterated single combat, his monotonous forest, relieved by no change of season, stand comparison for a moment with the inexhaustible inventions of the Italians. From this point of view, the fairy queen will appear but a faint shadow of its originals. If, on the other hand, you are a romantic, if your taste is for wonder rather than wonders, if you demand of poetry high seriousness and admission to a world of sensation which prose cannot enter, then you will find it just as easy to turn the tables. Dr. Richard complained that the poetry of Rupert Brooke has, quote, no inside. It would be easy to say the same of Ariosto's, to show how unevocative, how merely entertaining all his marvels are, how metallic and how external his pathos. It could even be argued that the clarity of his characters is a specious clarity, and that we never know more of them than prose could tell us. The whole thing, it might be said, is hardly poetry at all in the English sense of the word. Now, Lewis then refrains from pursuing this critique of Ariosto. His point is merely to highlight the particular power of Spenser's vision. Lewis is keen to expound the remarkable capacity of Spenser to evoke a mood of transcendence through his poetry. It is indeed poetic theology in this high sense. Ariosto, Lewis avers, may be the more accomplished poet in many respects, yet Ariosto is devoid of the singular power of Spenser to summon the experience of wonder and to quicken the imagination in the reader. Now, I don't wish to, and I couldn't, because neither am I an Italianist or a literary scholar, so I don't want to adjudicate the virtues or otherwise of Lewis's comparison here of Ariosto with Spenser. But it is striking that one of the most pivotal themes in Lewis is the human yearning for joy. And Lewis calls this longing for joy romantic. He even uses the German word Sehnsucht. So here's a long quotation that will be familiar to many of you from The Weight of Glory. In speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, which we find in ourselves even now, I feel a certain shyness. I am almost committing an indecency. I am trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of you, the secret which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when, in very intimate conversation, the mention of it becomes imminent, we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves. The secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly suggesting it, and we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of a name. Now, Wordsworth's spots of time that he discusses in this context is actually given short shrift, but Lewis considers such moments of aesthetic appreciation, such encounters with beauty, as intimations of transcendence. But what emerges through these aesthetic experiences, through the music, the book, the flower, is what comes through them, and that is the longing for what the heart really desires. Indeed, Lewis suggests rather sternly that if these experiences are confused with reality they should be conveying, they become harrowing idols. In this passage, we have the model of Platonic love as yearning, which Plato describes in the Symposium, in which Socrates recalls the teaching of the prophetess Diotima of Mantinea, who presents the mystery of love as essential to philosophy. And here the longing of reason, the passionate intellect, which can only find satisfaction in the transcendent region, this is the inconsolable secret of the heart's loving for joy that Lewis could find in Augustine, Pascal, or Coleridge, but was given magnificent poetic expression by Spenser. These longings are not some will-o'-the-wisp, but testify to an objective, transcendent reality that summons us. For this reason, great poetry resonates in the recesses of the soul. Lewis writes, in the 9th cantos, Spenser explicitly classifies eros, storge, and philia as 3 kinds of love. Finally, his conception of love is enlarged so as to include even the harmonies of the inanimate world, and we have the wedding of Thames and Medway. For all this embracing interpretation of love, Spenser, of course, has precedent in ancient philosophy, and especially in the Symposium. The stress in Lewis is upon the visionary or the contemplative dimension of Spenser's poetic theology. This trance or visionary mode is detected by Lewis in Spenser as a reference to the mood of Platonic transcendence and the idea of the poet as the seer. Ariosto begins with the situation, Roland's return from the east and Agramant's invasion of France. The fairy queen begins quite differently. A knight and a lady ride across our field of vision. We do not know where they are, nor in what period. The poet's whole energy is devoted to telling us what they look like. Ariosto begins with a man telling us very well and clearly the series of events he has heard. Spenser begins like a man in a trance, or a man looking through a window, telling us what he sees. And however deep we dig in Spenser, we shall never get to a situation, never find a context in the objective world for the shapes he's going to show us. As a more recent commentator states, unlike other Renaissance epics, the Fairy Queen does not merely use poetic theology intermittently, it is poetic theology. And this term, poetic theology, by the way, is used by the great Florentine Neoplatonist Pico della Mirandola. The great and much lamented Michael Allen notes of Ficino's interest in Christ's transfiguration as the supreme Platonic moment in the New Testament. This fascination for the transfiguration is shared by Spenser. Allen has demonstrated convincingly that the particular significance of the transfiguration as the mirroring, as it were, of the ascent of Moses upon Mount Sinai, whereby Mount Sinai and Mount Tabor both stand for the ascent of the soul to the divine. Spenser's Una is bathed in the light of Mount Tabor, and this is congruent with the Platonic style of Ficino's theology, with its stress upon theosis as the paradigm of salvation. For the Christian Platonist, deification rather than justification lies at the heart of Christian theology. So rather than a forensic or legalistic model of salvation in which the believer is judged worthy or not for redemption from sin, theosis is a model of transfiguration transformation into the image of the divine. And the language of theosis draws upon Platonic as well as biblical sources. So Lewis remarks, I have very little doubt that Dr. Janet Spence is right in supposing that glory would have been spiritualized and platonized into something very like the form of the good, or even the glory of God. And my belief is not shaken by the fact that there's very little in the existing poem to suggest this. Spenser's whole method is such that we have a very dim perception of his characters until we meet them, or their archetypes, at the great allegorical centers of each book. Now, glory, as you'll all know, is a very significant term for Lewis. It's the translation of the New Testament Greek of St. Paul of the word doxa. In Plato, this word connotes opinion as opposed to knowledge, and this is the general meaning of the term in ancient Greek literature. In the Septuagint, however, the word is used to mean glory in the sense of divine radiance or theophany. And in the New Testament, the Septuagint usage is normative, so the glory or the doxa refers to the substantial presence of God. And Lewis considered the relationship between earthly glory and divine splendor in which the Christian and the Platonist wished to participate. So Lewis writes, glory is the divine glory or splendor which the Christian soul will not only see but share in heaven. It is the glory of that real and perfect world which the Platonist is seeking. It is also, insofar as Arthur is a knight-errant in the romance of chivalry, glory in the sense of fame or honor. To add that it is also, in some sense, in some moments, Queen Elizabeth, seems to us profane and silly anticlimax. But we are not to suppose that Elizabeth appeared to Spenser as she does, or even as she did to contemporaries who really knew her. And we must understand that her royal office had importance for him which it could have for no modern. For monarchy, like everything else in this world, had its chief value in being the shadow or reflection of something in that other and more real world. Every earthly court was an imitation, however imperfect, of the divine court. Its splendor and order had a poetic, religious, and metaphysical appeal which had nothing to do with snobbery. It was a ritual appeal. Spenser would have understood the ancient Chinese idea that the function of the emperor was to reproduce on earth the order of heaven. His view is consistent, as we have seen, with the clearest insight into the corruptions of actual court life. So here we have this intensely Platonic sense of the world, and indeed of hierarchy in that etymological sense of hierarchy, so with the world as the sacred, hieros, of reflection of the principle, the arche. And the key thought is that of participation. Lewis notes that Spenser had a singular capacity to use simple elements in his work. He says, "We have long looked for the origins of the fairy queen in Renaissance palaces and Platonic academies, and forgotten that it has humbler origins of at least equal importance in the Lord Mayor's show, the chapbook, the bedtime story, the family Bible, and the village church. What lies next beneath the surface in Spenser's poems in the world of popular imagination is an almost popular mythology. And this world is not called up, as Ariosto may call up a fragment of folklore in order to amuse us. On the contrary, it is used for the sake of something yet deeper, which brings up with it and which is Spenser's real concern, the primitive or instinctive mind with all its terrors or ecstasies. That part of the mind of each of us which we should never dream of showing to a man of the world like Ariosto. The contrast between the urbane Italian, Ariosto, whimsically conjuring some folklore, and Spenser as the man attentive to the very depths of the soul, the primordial and subliminal mind with its terrors and ecstasies, is a striking opposition, and Lewis is candid about his own sympathies. The music of Spenser effects its magic with mighty images hewn from the deep. A significant part of consciousness dwells in symbols and in the semi-enchanted archetypal realm of fairy tales and myths. And yet, in the impersonal and utilitarian culture of Western democracies, we've been alienated from these numinous sources of meaning. And this, of course, may well explain the continuing appeal of Shakespeare through the centuries, Lord of the Rings or the Narnia tales. To the utilitarian mind, they are perceived as childish things, frivolous, but they express so often, grim realities. On November the 29th, 1917, C.S. Lewis turned 19 years old, and it was his first day in the trenches in First World War amid the harrowing and monstrous carnage of the Somme, and he subsequently wrote, "That first bullet I heard whined like a journalist's or a peacetime poet's bullet. At that moment there was something not exactly like fear, a little quavering signal that said, 'This is war. This is what Homer wrote about.'" A few months later, his best friend Paddy was killed, and Lewis himself was hospitalized through the shrapnel from the same explosion. Like his later friend Tolkien, who was also injured in the Somme, the exploration of the archetypes was not some escape into of a traumatized adult into a Peter Pan domain or Alice in Wonderland, but the exploration of good and evil, suffering and salvation. And Lewis's fascination for Spenser, I put to you, is part of this rejection of modernism and his hostility to many of the assumptions and ideals of the modern age. So here's Lewis on Spenser again. What he, Spenser, had always liked was the Middle Ages, as he imagined them to have been, and as they survived in his time from the pageant, the morality play, and the metrical romance. Thus he was enabled to produce a tale more solemn, more redolent of the past, more venerable than any real medieval romance, to deny in his own person the breach between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So here, of course, Lewis is consciously dismantling the idea of the Renaissance in the sense of Burckhardt as a breach with the Middle Ages and the emergence of modern rationalism and the erosion of medieval superstition. As a Renaissance scholar, a connoisseur of Spenser and Milton, Lewis intends to show how far they partake in this discarded image, as indeed did Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen. The modern mind, in the eyes of Lewis, is to be found as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the political convulsions of more recent past, rather than in some much vaunted Renaissance. So just as Lewis presents Spenser as the culmination, not the rejection of the medieval tradition in his allegory of love, the Elizabethan poet embodies precisely the denial of a breach between the medieval and Renaissance culture. When writing of the pre-modern mind, Lewis observes, "If I am right, the man of genius then found himself in a situation very different from that of his modern successor. Such a man today, often, perhaps usually, feels himself confronted with a reality whose significance he cannot know, or a reality that has no significance, or even a reality such that the very question whether it has a meaning is itself a meaningless question. It is for him, by his own sensibility, to discover a meaning, or out of his own subjectivity to give it a meaning, at least a shape to what in itself had neither. But the model of the universe our ancestors had a built-in significance, and that in two senses, as having significant form, it is an admirable design, and as a manifestation of the wisdom and goodness that created it. There was no question of waking it into the beauty of life. Ours, most emphatically, was not the wedding garment nor the shroud. The achieved perfection was already there. The only difficulty was making an adequate response to it." So Edmund Spenser provides a unique mirror into the mind of Lewis. Like Henry Moore, Lewis read Spenser as a child, and this formative influence of the epic Renaissance poet accompanied the Ulsterman throughout his adult career as a scholar and thinker. Lewis was an immensely accomplished man of letters, and his writing and lecturing on Spenser was part of his professional remit as a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature, a veritable great clerk. He would have doubtlessly objected to any insinuation that his account of the Renaissance poet was a projection of his own predilections. The history of scholarship is littered with misjudged attempts to foist the pet theories of the scholar onto the primary text. Yet just as one might say that a Christian interpretation of Milton is correct, not because Lewis was a Christian, but because Milton was a Christian, so equally one might say that a Platonic reading of Spenser is accurate because Spenser was a Platonist. Spenser and Lewis, both men for whom the experience of Ireland was formative, represent a profound meeting of minds, a sublime fusion of poetic theology, mythic lore, and Platonic metaphysics. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Professor Hedley, for such a deep presentation. It's very niche. For me, it was very difficult to get all the meanings, but I'm sure there are people here who are more close to this field, and that you wrote down your questions, because we'll still try to keep a Q&A towards the end. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our artist. Ross Willson is an Irish artist and a sculptor, and as you can see in his short bio, he is presented in many collections, in many museums. He's represented by some of the world's greatest galleries. But what impressed me from his biography, the short bio that we have, is his heart for the people and for using art to reach communities and to use art for education, both in North Ireland and in Rwanda. And I'm really looking forward to your speech. You can sit or you can stand.
Good evening. It's a great honor to be with you in Romania, and I would like to thank Denise for the invite to come, and also it's a great honor to be with the Romanian artists and to be part of their exhibition in the entrance hall to this building. I'd like to thank you also for the kind welcome that we received even from the first moment when we arrived at the airport, the courtesy that we were shown, and the hospitality. So I'm not an academic, and I sometimes feel frightened even about standing up to speak in front of people. But as a child, I was excited by the idea of seeing things, and I believe that we hear with our eyes first. We hear with our eyes first. And I think that was the case for Lewis as well. He was excited about seeing things as a child. In Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis wrote that he was the product of good parents, good food, and a garden. And Walter Hooper, a friend and writer and commentator, said this: Lewis struck me as the most thoroughly converted man I'd ever met. Christianity was never for him a separate department of life. His whole vision of life was such that the natural and the supernatural seemed to be always combined. So C.S. Lewis lived a Christ-shaped life. And for him, grace was a power for living, a power for obedience. And we're going to look at this idea of grace exchange and how Lewis used that and how it affected one particular person on the 5th of March, 1961. This is a great quotation. I think someone mentioned it earlier on in one of the other talks. God does not want something from us. He simply wants us. And Lewis realized that in his life, coming up to his conversion and onward from his conversion. So for Lewis, grace was a day-to-day thing. It was a divine influence that operated within him, the same grace that operates within us, and should be reflected in our day-to-dayness of life as it was for Lewis. Grace is the love of God shown to the unloved, the peace of God given to the restless. The American writer Anne Lamott makes this observation on grace: I do not understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us. And Walker Percy, the American writer, puts it like this: lost in the mystery of finding myself alive at such a time and place. So as grace receivers, we are to become grace givers. We must spell out the alphabet of grace day by day in our lives, in our actions, in our being, in our becoming more like Christ. Theology had a significance for Lewis, a cosmic significance. Theology was something not just known, it was something lived for Lewis. A lived experience, a three-dimensional living thing. Not just mere ideas for Lewis, but it was embodied in experience, a daily lived narrative that was a necessity for Lewis. For Lewis, theology was not just knowledge about God, it was knowing God. It was not just sentences or ideas. Lewis did not just quote the verse, he lived the verse. And we too are called to be the verse. Theology is not just to be knowledge about knowledge, it is to be lived. So C.S. Lewis did not just hang clothes in a wardrobe, he hung great ideas of sacrifice, redemption, victory, and freedom for the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. Great ideas found in the commonplace, revelation within something that looks ordinary on the outside, revelation through investigation. And we should never stop looking. Some of the greatest things can be found in the most ordinary of places, like a wardrobe. The Irish poet W.B. Yeats wrote this: by logic and reason we die hourly, by imagination we live. And Seamus Heaney, the Irish Nobel laureate, wrote, believe that a further shore is reachable from here. So C.S. Lewis points us to that other shore. He encourages us through his imagination, which was grace given, to move further up and further in. This is a journey many of you will know that Lewis took on the 28th of September 1931. And it's the journey from the kilns to Whipsnade Zoo. And it's a journey of about 40 miles from point A to point B. Point A is on the left, point B on the upper right. Lewis had this connection, a cosmic inward connection with the Holy Spirit, with a recognition of Christ, and this obviously all happened within the sidecar of his brother's motorcycle. So it's a 40-mile journey. When Lewis left the kilns, he was not aware of Christ being his Savior, or it was also a process of knowing Christ. But he also said that the great angler had his hook in my mouth for years. And this was the point where Lewis was being reeled in. And we can see this photograph. It's a rare photograph. I discovered it not so long ago and based on little portraits that are in the exhibition out there of Lewis on holiday with Mr. Papworth, his favourite dog, or the Baron as he called him. And I thought it was really nice because Lewis also had a sense of humour, and we can't overlook that. We should maybe have a conference on the humour of C.S. Lewis, which would be quite a well-attended conference, I would think. So this is not Lewis and Morney, but this is the type of motorcycle and sidecar they would have used, and they visited Whipsnade Zoo in September 1931. You can see a brochure there for the zoo. You can see chimpanzees driving zookeepers in the lower part of that image. That would never happen today for health and safety reasons. You can see the lion above, in the fields above Whipsnade, and also you can see a photograph of Mr. Bultitude that Lewis encountered on that day. Well, Warney encountered Mr. Bultitude first and came out and said, Jack, you must come in and see this little bear who salutes for buns. Jerry Root's really jealous that I found that photograph. It took me years to find it. But this is all part of Lewis's beginning in this idea and connection with grace and grace exchange. So this is a girl called Anne Waller, and in this photograph she's about 12 years old. But in 1961, on the 5th of March, she received a letter from C.S. Lewis. She'd written to him. She was concerned about this idea of this great lion, Aslan, giving himself up for the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve. And she asked her mother, why did Aslan lay down his life? Her mother didn't know. Her mother said, why didn't you write to the person who wrote the book? So she wrote to Lewis. And Lewis wrote back, and I saw that letter in 1997 in the study of Douglas Gresham. And when I read the letter, the hair stood up in the back of my neck. It had a profound effect on me. Me and another friend, who's quite a well-known hymn writer now, wanted to do something to commemorate Lewis's centenary. There was a plaque being unveiled in Belfast, the blue plaque, and there was a crusty lecture that we went to at Queen's University, and we thought we needed to do something to create a C.S. Lewis weekend. So he wrote a musical called Jack, and I then had the idea, when I read the letter, of making a sculpture. I'd only made one sculpture before that, and it was a commission by a brewing company called Bass, and I found the experience of working with Bass very sobering. Yeah. So this is a beautiful quotation by Lewis. My task was therefore simply to that of a translator, turning Christian doctrine. Are you okay? Yeah. Turning Christian doctrine has that effect on some people sometimes. Turning Christian doctrine into a language that people would attend to and could understand. So here we have the letter. And this letter is now in Queen's University in the Special Collections room. And I take students to see it once a semester. So you can see that this young girl, 10-year-old Anne Waller, lived on Poultry Farm. Her father was a chicken farmer, and Suffolk is the area. And when I read the letter, it really impacted me, and I had to find her, and I traced her in 1997. And I remember the day I got that final call to the right person. I went through phone books, I went through all kinds of connections, and this woman answered the phone, and I said, did you write to C.S. Lewis when you were 10? She said, how do you know that? This letter hasn't been published. I said, well, I saw a copy of the letter, well, where did you see that? I said, I saw a photocopy in Douglas Gresham's study. She said, yes, I did. Wow, you know about that letter? I said, can you tell me what it was like? Yeah, well, I was very concerned about this lion giving himself up. So I wrote to Mr. Lewis. And she said, I'll never forget the day when that letter came to my house. My mum came to my bedroom door and knocked the door. It was a Saturday morning. I was off school. And her mum handed her the letter and said, who do you know in Cambridge? Because the letter had the Cambridge stamp mark on it. She said, I read that letter and I carried that letter in my pocket for 2 years. Mr. Lewis helped me find my faith, which is pretty profound. And here we have the letter. It's a half A4, both sides, and I'll bring you up a clear view of that, but I just wanted you to see that, because the handwriting in this letter is, I think somebody else has mentioned this today about writing. I'm not sure it was Andrew, about this idea of writing with the pen, dipping. Lewis would have dipped the pen in the inkwell and writing, but between the lines and in the ink of this letter is grace. We have grace in these words. We have grace exchanged in these sentences. And this is what Lewis said about Narnia to this 10-year-old girl. The whole Narnian story is about Christ. That is to say, I asked myself, supposing there really were a world like Narnia, and supposing it had, like our world, gone wrong, and supposing Christ wanted to go into that world and save it as he did ours, what might have happened? The stories are my answer. Since Narnia is a world of talking beasts, I thought he would become a talking beast there as he became a man here. A, because I pictured him becoming a lion, because A, the lion is supposed to be the king of the beasts. B, Christ is called the Lion of Judah in the Bible. And C, I'd been having strange dreams about lions when I began writing the books. The whole series works out like this, and then he lists the books with the meanings across them. So that's pretty profound. One paragraph explains the whole concept, and he wrote it in a way where he wasn't talking down to a child, but he was talking to almost like an equal. So when I read that letter, it inspired me. I wanted to do something, and as I said, just done one sculpture before, and I wanted to make a sculpture. And there was no money to make the sculpture. The money had to be raised, and the first person to donate that sculpture was my little niece, who's now 30 years old. So when she was 5, she gave me £5.50 from her piggy bank. She was the first donator, and that had a profound effect on me. So this letter is a really important artifact. And here we have a photograph of Anne when she was older, and she came to the unveiling of the sculpture with the letter. She was so pleased. And on the back of the wardrobe is the letter in bronze. And she later donated that letter to Queen's University, where Lewis's mother graduated Flora. She was one of the first female graduates from Queen's. And here we have the sculpture, which is 25 years old this year. I find that hard to believe. Time does really go fast. But that's how it turned out. But there was lots of things happened before that, and it had to be put in place. We had to raise the money. I went to the Belfast City Council. I said, look, we're doing this project. The guy said, oh, that's amazing, C.S. Lewis, my daughter's reading his books. How much is this going to cost? This is 25 years ago. I said, it's going to cost about £80,000. I naively thought the site could be done for £3,000, but it was £45,000. So he said, yeah, we can give you 85% of the funding for this sculpture from the lottery. And I said, well, I know you're going to think this is really weird, but I couldn't really accept that because Lewis would not be happy with that. And from a theological point of view, I couldn't accept it. And he said, well, how much money have you got in place? I said, £5.50. He said, right, okay, so you've got £5.50? I said, yeah. And you're refusing 80% funding from us, 80% of the total price? I said, yeah. He said, well, get out of my office. And as I was leaving, I turned and said, is there not some other fund I can tap into? He said, well, there is, but you need to have more than £5.50 in place. You need to have several £1,000s. So I remember walking out of Belfast City Council offices and walking down the street thinking this was never going to happen. And then 2 weeks later, I got a phone call saying that an anonymous person wanted to donate £6,500 to start the fund off. So I went back to the council offices 2 weeks later and said, look, I've got £6,505.50. He said, where did you get £6,500 in 2 weeks? I said, it was donated, and it was donated anonymously. Why would someone want to donate £6,500 anonymously? I said, because they don't want to be known. He thought I was trying to pull some kind of scam. He said, look, when you go and get a bank account set up with 2 independent trustees, a Belfast City Councillor and a business person, and come to me with a bank statement, C.S. Lewis Sculpture Fund, and I see £6,500, £5.50, then you can apply for some money. So in another 2 weeks, I went back with the bank statement, and he just couldn't believe it. And we got £10,000 from the City Council. Northern Ireland Electricity, who are a multi-million-pound company, donated £95. Yeah, £95. And this is true. In the last 25 years, I've never paid a power bill on time. I've waited for that court case letter. We're going to take you to court if you don't pay your power bill. And then I pay it, because I'm still not letting that go, that £95. The other people who donated, and I'd like to make a point of mention at this stage, is a tea blending company in East Belfast called Punjana. It's a beautiful tea blend. I know Andrew has experienced Punjana and may have some actually at home. So I'd recommend that. They give £2,000. So that's how it started to proceed. So this is the day that the sculpture came on site. And it was in November time. It was put in place 2 days before Lewis's centenary. And this is arriving from Dublin. There's no foundry in the north of Ireland to do it, so it had to be done in Dublin. And this is the stonemason. You can see it's on a sort of rig that's been bolted into a foundation. Then it's been filled up with hardcore. And then we have the text around it, which part of it says C.S. Lewis, date of birth 1898, date of rebirth 1931. So when it was being put in place, I was feeling quite confident about it, and a lady walked past with 2 shopping bags, and she said, that wardrobe will be burnt in a week, son. They'll burn it in a week. I said, it's not bronze, it's not wood, it's bronze. It will be burnt in a week. And I thought, there are people out there with the blessed gift of discouragement. And the first person to make comment on the sculpture was a discourager. And the second person to make comment on the sculpture was a discourager. It was a guy who walked right up to me and said, why are you putting a sculpture up in Belfast to Lewis Carroll? I said, it's not Lewis Carroll, it's C.S. Lewis. What has Lewis Carroll got to do with East Belfast? I thought, right. So the 2 interactions were really discouraging. And I thought, this is not going to work. People are not going to like this. It hasn't connected. And then about an hour later, I felt this tugging at my coat, and turned around, and there was 3 little girls. Mister, is this about C.S. Lewis? I said, yeah. We love him. We're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe at the minute. What's that chair for? I said, well, the chair is for children to sit on so they can be transported through the imagination of Lewis and into Narnia. Wow. Can we be the first ones to sit on the chair? I said, sit on the chair. Yeah. So I happened to have a little camera with me and took that photograph. Those girls would be in their early to mid-30s now, because they were just about 8 or 9 years old then. And I've often wondered what's become of them, but they got it. So the first person to donate was a 5-year-old, my niece, who's now in her 30s. And the first positive comment were from 3 little kids. And I thought, it's going to work. They get it. If they get it, that's good. The adults with all the mental baggage and concerns about fire and Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland and all that kind of stuff don't get it, but they got it. So that was really important to me, and I knew it was going to work. And so it was unveiled the next day, and I couldn't believe how many 300 people turned up to the unveiling. Since then, 18 years later, Belfast City Council saw the worth of Lewis and put £3 million in place to build a park area behind that sculpture. And there's 8 or 9 other sculptures there, which were heavily financed. I didn't get involved in those because I knew that I could not do anything better than this. that this was one of those grace moments that was pushed forward by Grace Exchange, by a Cambridge professor sitting down late in life and writing a profound letter to a 10-year-old girl that changed her life, that she carried in her pocket for 2 years. And that's the part of Grace Exchange that I love when it comes to Lewis. And it's something that we can learn from as individuals. It's something we have to carry into our lives as believers. And for those of us here who don't believe, it's something we have to consider in our lives. So this is a new paving area. You can see it's different from the old one. It's part of the new project. So when they put the £3 million into this C.S. Lewis square behind the sculpture, they wanted to move this sculpture into that area. And I said, no, I don't want it to be moved. It's outside the library. It's to encourage children to go into the library and interact with reading. And I said, look, if you do try to move it, I will take it away. And they said, well, where would you put it if you took it away? I said, I know an American university who'd be very happy to have it. So they didn't budge, they kept it. So these are some details of the sculpture. And you can see they put I tried to get the name changed 25 years ago to C.S. Lewis Square, but they wouldn't listen to me. But now they've done it. And that's another shot of the sculpture, which is a really nice photograph. And this is the letter in the back. And I think there's you can see the list of donors. And the dove at the top represents the guy who gave the £6,500. And then you can see there's an NIE there. You can see it down towards the bottom. That's Northern Ireland Electricity, who gave the £95. So they didn't merit even words. I just put an abbreviation. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, it shows you what can happen when you put your mind to it and when I believe God is in a project like that. So this is precisely what Christianity is about. This world is a great sculptor's shop. We are the statues, and there's a rumor going around the shop that some of us are someday going to come to life. Oh yeah, and this is based on Diggory Kirk. Me and my friend Keith had to join the C.S. Lewis Centenary Group. We thought they'd finance the sculpture, but they didn't have any money. We had to finance them. We actually had to raise money for them to make a brochure. And then they had this discussion. They wanted the old Lewis, the young Lewis, this Lewis, that Lewis. And I thought, these guys aren't even donating. So I said, well, it's going to be Diggory Kirk. And they didn't know what Diggory Kirk looked like. So it's loosely based on the young Lewis. So these are some projects I've done in and around that area of Belfast with kids. I think it's really important to connect with children, to interact, to show creativity, to let them be part of the process, and to show their creativity. And it's been amazing working with children. It's so edifying. So this is a beautiful quotation. You would not have called to me unless I'd been calling to you, said the lion. So the question I want to leave you with tonight or this evening is not what are we now, but what are we becoming? What are we becoming as grace receivers? Francis Schaeffer said this: no work of art is more important than the Christian's life. And every Christian is called to be an artist in this sense. The Christian's life is to be a thing of truth and also a thing of beauty in the midst of a lost and despairing world. On the 22nd of November 1963, it was not the day that Lewis died. It was the day he truly began to live. It was the day he moved further up and further in to the new country, to be surprised by joy through grace and experience the eternal beauty he had always yearned for, to be fully in the company of Christ, his Redeemer, who had sought him. The grace exchange of C.S. Lewis still impacts us today. At the conclusion of his book, The Last Battle, these familiar words are written. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can truly say that they lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All of their life in this world and all of their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. C.S. Lewis said, there are far, far greater things ahead than any we leave behind. So we are in need of rescue, of being restored in Christ. Grace is our true rescue. Grace liberates our identity. Grace enables us to be Christ-like. Grace brings faith. Help us in our weakness, and help those of us who have turned aside to return. In Ephesians 1:18 it says this, I pray that your hearts will be flooded with light, so that you can understand the confident hope he has given to those he called his holy people, who are his rich and glorious inheritance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ross. As I promised you, this is a session more for the heart. We are going to take now a few questions and then a very short last coffee tea break. Two questions. I hope you're not left speechless. Yes.
For Professor Hedley.
Yes.
A comment and a question. We at last know the answer to the question, what are they teaching them there, at least at Clare College? At least at Clare College, they're teaching the right things about Platonism. My question is, can you comment about Tolkien's approach to Spenser and the Fairy Queen at all, or is this out of your particular interest?
Okay. That's a very interesting question, but one I'm afraid I can't reply to. I suppose that Spenser was part of C.S. Lewis's bread and butter. I mean, that he was a part of his teaching and work as a scholar, and Tolkien, of course, was, in that respect, a scholar of a much older literature. So it would be surprising if one found anything comparable in Tolkien for that reason. But nevertheless, it strikes me that there are very great overlaps between what Lewis finds so important in the Fairy Queen and aspects of the archaic literature that Tolkien worked on professionally.
Thank you.
One more question. Yes, we have 1, 2, 3. The lady was first. Sorry, honey.
Yes, I wanted to comment on both. I see the two lectures tying together beautifully, and I thank you for that. Spenser is in my heart and soul. Yeah, at our university, they once needed a class. When I first got there 10 years ago, they needed a class on the spot for graduate students, and they said, well, something in Renaissance, we just don't want full Renaissance. I said, well, how about Spenser? They said, how about we call it Elizabethan court literature? I said, that's fine, but it's Spenser, and a few of the others thrown in. But when Mr. Willson, I forget your first name.
Ross.
Yes.
Ross Willson.
Yeah, Ross, yes. When you talked about seeing is hearing, what did you say? Seeing is hearing first. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That's Spenser. Because Spenser paints with his words. I mean, everything he gives you is the landscape of Ireland and the beauty of his words and the recreation of the medieval that he puts. I love the way you have put that, and the ties to Lewis from both. And I guess this is more of a comment of just how those two tied together. And Spenserian art, are you familiar with Spenser, anything in Spenser, or have you studied Spenser? I guess that's it's from an artistic standpoint.
I haven't studied Spenser. The Spenser I would be familiar with is Sir Stanley Spenser, who's a painter.
Okay.
Who painted amazing pictures in Cookham of the resurrection and profound. I mean, my Spenser knowledge is just about being excited about seeing things and about waking up every morning and seeing light. And I'm sure Spenser probably felt like that as well.
Yes, I think so. And I'm so sorry to see it's not in the venue of most of our universities anymore. I'm highly dedicated to preserving that one piece of literature, The Fairy Queen, because it's so important, I think. But anyway, I won't take more time. Sorry.
Well, thank you so much, but I think every woman would understand my position as being the one to tell my husband to speak or not to speak. So, for the sake of my safe return home, would you please allow a question from him as well?
You were talking about grace in C.S. Lewis' lives and in ours. Question: when building that extraordinary sculpture that you've made, did you have something, any feelings about grace for yourself?
Well, I started to build that sculpture just after I was married, and I did experience grace from my wife because I started to build that sculpture in my kitchen. Seriously, I built the figure in our kitchen, and I'd only been married a few weeks, and after about a month, my wife said, "Look, I think you may need to work. You may need to move the figure out of the kitchen." For me, that was a normal thing to do, like to start a sculpture in the kitchen, but I then realized that marriage and being with someone else is about sharing, and but not sharing a 6-foot bronze wax figure in the kitchen. So yeah, but I mean, I experienced grace first of all from my little niece who gave me all the money out of her piggy bank. Looking back on that now, it's a big thing. I didn't maybe realize how big it was at the time, but then sort of bookending it with the other kids, they were big grace moments. When those 3 little girls said, "We love Mr. Lewis," that spoke to me greatly. And I've had a few experiences in front of that sculpture with other people, just almost, I'll say it, I mean, providentially, they've been experiences. And I've experienced grace through that exchange that Lewis put in place first. And through the traveling of that grace, through that letter, into that other child's life, that changed her life. Grace that came through words of encouragement, that came through words of vision, that came through words of explanation. And this idea of grace and attention is really important. And all of us need to think about the idea of giving others attention. And Simone Weil, the French philosopher, said that attention is one of the rarest and purest forms of generosity. And that is a grace-oriented thing. So, yes, I did experience it. I may not have been aware of how powerful it was at the time, but in the rear-view mirror of hindsight, I can see it was a very powerful thing.
Well, Ross, as a sculptor's wife, I would confess that I would have kept the wardrobe.
Oh.
Take out the figure, but keep the wardrobe and the chair.